Hello, my name is Amol Samant, and today we are going to discuss about how the commercial trends into the negotiation training into the trial agreements is. And here we will be discussing about the negotiating the clinical trial agreements. It's one of the activities when the hospitals or the industries itself into the clinical trials, and this is one of the sources of the income other than the clinical patients that they usually they derive. The clinical trial agreement, it is the agreement with the terms and the conditions like the finances and so many points about the clinical trial and the institute of hospitals and the investigators like the doctors, the pedestrians are there. Who start with the clinical control agreement? Let us understand think of the very important crux of the entire market. We have entire understand that all the services would pharma, biotech, or dental are more interested in this than the hospitals. So this are the one who needs the entire market and the goods, and therefore we have to control that agreement. We have to keep the agreement as well as hospital administrators. And there are two important points to be considered. The most important point is that it is confidence management that we are not taking care of the management from the clinical trials. There are things from clinical pharmaceutical sector conditions like the management giving the clinical trials is something that they are bringing additionally to the management, and there is a requirement for the part of the payments that they are getting. And we at payment, we have to give some part of the payment as a part of clinical participations. That's also going on the credit that we have to billing the doctors, and then the agreement may not be signed. And is not controlled the agreements guidelines like this agreements to control to the strict ethics committee institutional board for the clinical plan, and many times the strong HR points the ethical SPs and the strong studying at the time the hospital institution both are the parties, and this is one of the best policies to achieve the control on the agreement. So now another important thing is that to talk about the insurance clauses. We are going to know about the insurance clauses of the researchers, of the research of the sponsors who will negotiate with the agreements. But when it comes to the agreement, the insurance policies of the hospitals and clinic professionals in the hospitals, they have to make sure that the picture that the professional the product liability insurance, clinical liability insurance is a group. One of this group owns on this risk that will be imposed on doctors in the clinical trial participations. And when we trial aware of negotiating claim agreements, what are professional claims agreements, what is the product liability, and hospital covers the professional insurance, and therefore this part has to us totally opposite to the clinical trial agreements. Now, these agreements are some of the important aspects of the clinical agreements where we have these points that needs to be covered. These are like the parties, properties, the intellectual properties, so on. Clinical trial agreements, the evaluations between the cities as parties. As it would conventionally there should be three parties before having the proper control over the first party, the executing party, is usually the sponsor. Sometimes the sponsor may delegate the responsibility to CRO. CRO then the commence the agreement with the institutional the investigations. Many times, the investigating doctor, this himself may represent an institute. As I told, there are three parties involved, so there will be the proper control over the academics of institution sites. This is very important for defining the roles and the responsibilities of all these entities beforehand. When we speak about the institutes and entities, the rules and the responsibilities must be defined, and the investigation entities as a rule must be defined. When these three things are being better defined, then will be definitely have the proper control over the entire process agreement. So the purpose of the CA or the clinical trial agreement is that the type of the study, what kind of the FIM pivotal, what are the objectives of the study that the research is being made, the scope of the work, the study in the institutes, then what will be the title of the study, what are the different FOCs for the face-to-face and studies, or the phase 3 studies, or the phase 4 studies, that is the usually post-marketing studies. Depending upon the studies that is being proceeded, the kind of agreement that is being undertaken, and the studies are executed, there will be a lot of the differences on the hospital's contributions to the risk hospitals and the risk of and the patients during the of the study. So for example, when we talk about the FAM studies, we has a usually have the higher studies about agreement when the product is highlighted will be studying about the risk will be higher, and therefore we have to understand that the insurance must be very strong. The indemnity must be very strong. The clauses that will be covered, the form will be correct and checked and thorough. As soon as the agreements, regulatory approvals, regulatory insistence must be. So when we talk about the pharmaceutical kinetic studies, in a certain the kinetic studies can be separately understandable as the in a clinical study, we try to understand about how the frequently the samples, what is the critical monitoring, and everything will be very, very deep. So in this case, the understand and stress the staff and the staff will be high. And because of this, we have to about the trial periods, we have to understand the impact on the business studies and the finances. So the pivotal and the phase study or the phase 3 studies are the usually regulatory approvals. They are the most common studies that are received by the clinical research departments or the investigation during the hospitals, and the phase 4 studies will be about another studies that constitutes about the bulk of the studies, especially in the medical devices. So we have to understand this many phase 4 studies we have to post pivotal studies. They also want to buy the product, especially when the expensive product is expensive, like the biosimilars or the medical devices, fridges, then you have to be making the buy the product. That should be the agreement, and that should have the proper thorough understandings about the activities. So the objectives of the study is that the study objectives can be different, can be many times, and can also be looked after like the simple collections of the data, reporting of the data, analytics, the reporting of the data. It can be very elaborate research about the research matters, such as the has the impact on the various populations and the various combinations about etc. So in the simple so from arrangements of the studies depends upon the objectives. What kind of the objectives? It has to add the additional value to the doctors or too many data points to collect. The objectives of the study should be like that. It should be directly linked with the involvement of the studies, the scope of the work of the institutions, and accordingly the time that is being required for the staff is that it requires the stress that the institution is going to bear because of the additional participation in the study must be very clear so that the finances can be negotiated. The title of the study is one of the important study because if the title says that something says that some percentage, then it will be criteria of very high vigilance. So if there is a very high vigilance, then we have to have the very vigilant to understand about the part. And as I told earlier, that is post surveillance study. the sponsors may want to buy the product, and in that case, the product is not sufficient or free of cost, then the product is not with a special purchase price. Then that has to be negotiated accordingly, and you have to say in the finances sections. In the intellectual property, also branding. This is one of the most important part, the elements that we have to learn. So especially when we are dealing about the foreign customers, or when the customers are foreign sponsors, so the customers are different, and we are very speaking with the Indian clients or the Indian sponsors, where the customs are different, then we have to be very sure about how exactly this will be displayed and what can be displayed and how it can be displayed with not. So if I say about the intellectual property of the patients of the original data, because the patient is treated in the original patients or whatever is being treated or is participating in the trials or not, the patient original data is always the important and retained in hospitals. It does not involve and does not involve into the intellectual property. So the patient original data should always there into the hospitals. Data that is being collected or out of the patient's points for the participation in the clinical trial is a typical point, a particular point of the study that will go with the sponsors of the intellectual properties. So, however, whenever on the collections of this data, if we find certain trend, or if we are willing to publish those trends, or those rights can be there to the data for the having the understanding of the original of the patients and not from the sponsors or the original efforts of the collection of the business data. So for this, I want to understand that sponsors must not have the data, global hospitals, brands, collections, hospitals, data, logos, unless it, etc., unless it is always defined in the protocol from the similar way or the similar objects or the objectives of the similar segments. So, for example, when you talk about the business brand, it has to be very distinctive. So, if you are participating in the clinical trials as an executive or only defined as purpose, there should only names and hospitals name, logos, and any branding that is material during the courses of the clinical trial. It should not be showing that we are an associate of the blah blah hospitals or we are working with so and so hospitals. So that should not be used as a business value or the part of the business integral systems or the part of the integral marketing systems themselves. And if they want to publish this information, the logos to the particular hospitals, marketings, the clear combinations must be taken from the institutes or the hospitals with the final review of the content with put with the logos of the hospitals. So with this part of the branding part is very sensitive and must be taken very seriously. And whenever the certain branding of the hospitals is being used for certain hospitals for the clinical trials, then for these or the hospitals or the reports, then due credit should also to be given to the hospital. So that is the must. So if the hospital is participating in the clinical trials as well as that hospitals, the three investigations are 25 into the subjects into that, then in that this matter is shown somewhere where the hospitals should be given the credit about understandings for these allowations in the participations and for whatever. And for this important is the clinical trial agreement that is being negotiated. This cannot only sure about the interest of the hospitals in branding of the intellectual property, it will also expect and the legal and the regulatory aspects of if something goes wrong. Now, what comes into the most important part of the clinical trial is that of finances. The finances part of clinical data also have the several aspects to it, but the most important part of the it comes with the budget. Budget is the most important part that is known by different names. It will be talks about budgets. It should also be talked about clinical phase investigations, brands, also known as trial brand for the client. And for this, budget is the most important area for the components and parts. And for this, the multi-components part, the first most important thing that comes into the is manpower, the staff that is being required in the clinical trials. Clinical trial, there will be the different kinds of the staff there may be participating. There will be the doctors, there will be the nurses, there will be the technicians, there will be the department operators, administrators, and certain kinds of non-skilled functions. These staff will be having their own overly skills. So if there are 25 different patients for 1 to 7 hours to participate in the clinical, there has to be salary shall be required, which certain markup of hospitals from the investigators grant, and that is important aspect to be known from the clinical trials. Space and the infrastructure required, especially the crowded hospital or crowded areas like the Mumbai, New York, UK, there should be a space and the clinical setups depending upon what kind of supplies does the sponsor sends to the certain amount of the task, a certain amount of space required in the initial stage required for the clinical trials. And such as if the doctor is having the investigations for the doctors for this, there will be 100 to 150 to almost 175 units will be going, and if maybe more, if the size matrix is more, or if the size matrix is bigger. And with a huge inventory, and there will be probably higher amount of the spaces required, and for that spaces will be required for the quite something, unless if the recruitment is over. If the patient is given the bid per CR, it will go to the space. And this must understood while we are negotiating the business agreements, because the space and the maintenance or the infrastructure that is being required to carry out all these things, even though if it is all electronically all these things, then will computer services will be required, and all these costs will be have some additional effect on the business conducts and the conduct on the business health. And for this, it is also required to have understand about the finances of the entire budget for the budgets. So the deliverables of the clinical trials usually is the data, but sometimes they may also have certain additional things like certain the laboratory investigation and certain high amount of the samples collected, certain biological, certain views. They may require certain the basis of the angiography, certain studies. In case of CT scans, they will want the all these ECG graphs and all, what kind of the investigations, what kinds of deliverables, and every deliverables must have also have the cost involved with it. So for this cost, we have the clinical trials, the budgets with the markets of the hospitals, and so that if there is any clinical trials or if any want to bring the losses, at least at the back one point. Like I told, besides the investigation plans, there will also be certain parts of the finances in the clinical plans agreements. So for this, whenever in the trials of the trial agreements between us, then there is a share of the agreements that has to be grow or has to be circulated into the business hospitals, has to be investigation into the institute. Majority of the work is being done by the doctors. The proportionate amount of the doctors will go and certain amounts will go to the institute. So if certain institutes grabs everything of sidelining the business agreements, then it is one of the most important risks that has to be sidelined of has to be important risk. The investigators may not be interested into that or bringing the clinical trials into the institutes. And we cannot force them for the doctors for participating in the doctors for the clinical trials. The product cost is also in the post-market scenarios where the product will be purchased in the hospitals or will be built into the hospitals. In that case, the special pricing must be negotiated. Usually, in the post-marketing surveillance, the devices will be high cost for the business studies, and for this, they have to go into the business studies and they have to go into the business cases, and they have to be very experts into the business aspects. So for this, the expertise communication is one of the most important things for the very. Then for this, we are giving the time, they have to support the certain MSSP paid. And for this requirements usually comes from the ethical communication field. So even if doctor's funds doesn't earn of it, but their time and entire infrastructure of the ethics committee must be recovered from the ethics committee fees, and there are certain regulations for the ethics committees which we have to be very careful in certain aspects or certain norms for the ethical community. The United Kingdom, the ethics committee cannot charge anything to anybody. So in Europe, they can most of the ethics committees do not charge money. But in India, the ethics committee charge certain fees. So we have to be very carefully about the legal regulations and local conventions about the ethics committee's fees. The next is the tax payment. When we're dealing with the outside India sponsors, we have to be very careful. So tax payments in India are different from the tax payments in Europe or in the other countries. We have to be extremely careful about being about will be paying about the taxes in Indian counterpart, that is hospitals, tax to be calculated to be 50 percentage. The budget will be reaching only if you are reaching to the 50 percentage. We have to be very careful of this exercise. If the tax Indian party and the Indian religion that is 10 to 30 percentage to the fact that the amount is being paid. And in this case, the proper documentations of the taxes, the proper documentations of the tax, and the proper infrastructures about the tax deductions, the tax certifications will also be negotiated at the start of the agreement itself, and it has to be written into the process in the agreement itself. The bank charges. Bank charges, when talked about, it also looks after the foreign exchanges, and for that, it also requires the bank's major important part because the major many important that the bank charges are high out of the as high at the 30 percentage of the entire budget. So if the payment budget is coming from outside India, then it is usually recommendable that the bank charges inside India are borne by the hospitals at the cost or at the maximum. Or the entire taxes or the entire bank charges will be done by the payer. So these are the some of the market hospitals expect that has to be negotiating with the budget. So on top of it, it's a requirement for the irrational budget. For the irrational budget, because it cannot be judged or cannot be moved with the budgeting aspects. And for this, we have to be very, very careful about the negotiating correcting value. So this correct value is not only means that these are getting of the 20 percentage of the markup, but this also means that patient gets the better benefits, hospitals gets the better benefit, and this usually because the hospitals, the entire agreement value or the entire commitment value is big. And for this, the sponsor is in the position to putting some extra payments out of it for the efforts on the extra resource and extra resource. So, case there are certain popular excuses like the other companies are willing to pay higher and so are willing to match with their can consider you as participating at a clinical research or the clinical centers. So the popularity of the center, popularity of the investigators, the face of the institute, forgiveness can be different. But negotiable, but nevertheless, if the company pay for the higher amount, then there is nothing higher or benefits if the benefits are proper people. Terms are the payments. One of the important are more to impact first. For this first must be understandable by the agreement to be done by the milestone basis. When the first follow-up or the enrollment is complete, the patient enrollment is then there will be a sponsor agreements and it will get a 50 percentage to 65 percentage of half of the payment. So at half of the 10 percentage to 50 percentage. So this will be the first addition to that. There will be frequency of the payments. It can be paid monthly, it can be paid monthly, it can be paid quarterly, it can be paid yearly. But with this, must be decided. And for after frequency has been decided, the process of payment should be clearly defined. The process of payment means what? The value will be used by the institute, whether the rate is CRO or approved by the institute will be approved by the sponsor or suggested the invoice by the hospitals, and when should the invest, what should be the invoice process, whose invoice process should be there, will be the mode of the invoices, whether that invoices process will require hard copy, whether all these things will be at the start. For this, it is at the end of this, it is also required to understand the terms and conditions that we have to understand about the part, that how many days or invoice or will be allowed. On pediments, how many days will be allowed, and what happens if there is a delay. So, for example, here, what will be the paying party, whether it will be a hospital, or whether it will be the trust, or whether it will be the investigator that has stipulated before the agreement is being executed. Many times it happens that a certain parties allowed for the transaction. For example, if an investigator is a paying party, he may not be agreement about parties. But for this, the paying party must be the party of the agreement. So we have to be very careful about the understandings about the paying party. And for the payment party should be investigations. The payment should be investigators grant. First, they may have the different aspects. For the two different aspects are there, different. Then we have to be very careful about secondary transactions. The payment of investigations are credited or credited to understand the documents where it comes of, you know, mm, all the pages must be the part of the agreement. And for this, it is also required to understand about what exactly the tax certificate is applicable when the tax are deducted by the sponsors. For example, when you collect 16E, and that is being collected the sales that to claim the credit tax. Of this, the payment for the, or if the payments of the product done by the hospitals, then they can be either paid out or they can be adjusted between against the, the payables from the sponsor. All clauses must be agreement basis overall. For this, the agreement finances are the most finance sensitive, and for this, it is also required good, and after everything will be very simple. When there is a one single problem, that the entire payment transactions will be delayed, and the entire trial processes will be delayed. And for this, many trials will be completed, but payments will not be done. Therefore, the agreement has to be revised. Everything has to be done with the calculated at the complexities at the backend. And for this, it is required to understand about the business. So for this, it is required Indian parties has to be very same parties, the motor rights in that case, the updated agreements or the amendments will not be possible. So for the investigation process or the investigating document, even though this is two different things, there is a different trials. Right? For example, that different parties should be into various parts. First most important part is the handling. So if we are handling manually or the effort required in the efforts will be different. So if they be different in parts, then parts of will be different. The skills will be different. So accordingly, stress on hospitals will be higher. The storage of the conditions, especially for the drug or the devices, that also will matter about some parts to the cost of for the center. And that has to be very carefully understandable before agreement is being finalized or completed. Then we talk about the waste part, the product, the supplies, like the files, papers, concerned forms, the drugs, the devices, whatever comes into the sponsor. That will be one of the important parts, or the cost will be the different cost of the centers. So that has to also consider when you are speaking about terms and the clinical times agreement. Duration of the storage. When we talk about the regulatory bodies, that means they have to store about the records for certain is for 50 years. So if the cost is recorded is good, then the cost has to be considered for the full reductions, not for the trial period. So who will be bearing this cost is also another. what happens if storage comes complete? So, for example, if the 5 minutes is going complete for the records or the 5 year storage terms is completed, and we are not going to put what to do out of it. So by now, people, other people's are being changed. But there is a black hole. So now we have to understand about these things, the point of agreement and the point of agreement itself. After the completion of the agreement of the 5 years, so this paper has to be shared off. The certification must be taken by the sponsor, or it has to be shared off. It has front of the sponsor. This will be shared, sponsors will be shared out, and the certificate of hospitals and the vice versa. After this, all the things will be done. The important thing is that all the process is cost, and the cost will be cost money. So who will be paying this money? One of the important aspects of aspect is must be taken care. And when we are talking about a clinical trial agreements, so for this it is also required to understand confidential level, security level, the confidentiality of the patients or the patients of the record hospitals. That it is the responsibilities or a very important understanding confidentiality history of the data, the security of the business data, the security of the higher pillars, these things, and the joint responsibility of the sponsor, or it will be the joint responsibility of the hospitals, or it is with the negotiations set of the confidentiality agreements must be very sure about the institutes and the sponsor. Sponsor any of these patients in the identification documents, or if they refuse, then they will be used for special purposes. They cannot even publish these documents with even with the special identification number of the data for the certain regulation. Insurance, indemnity, and the compensation. Insurance, as I discussed earlier, the insurance is one of the most tricky subject in the clinical trial matters, because the clinical there are three parts: product liability insurance, which is applicable to all the products. Many times the excluded out of it. The professional liability insurance about talks about the liability arises from the doctors treating the patients or the staff dealing with the patients, but many times the clinical trials is the student of it, and the third is the clinical trial liability insurance. The clinical trial liability insurance sometimes that the entire liability of patients being treated by the doctor under the clinical trial, but many times the malpractices are excluded out of it. Therefore, when we are looking for the clinical trial agreements, that very extremely documents into the terms, conditions, agreements, clause, or the place into the business picture to be into the business. And if there is a businesses not being good, then that will be into the practices insurance article. Also, that if some objection comes in, then the agreement serves as evidence. Insurance does not file with an excuse. But second insurance part is that the clinical trial insurance liability, the clinical liability insurance must be covered all genuine business practices with the optimum realizations with the risk. So for this, it is a understands about people minimum risk that must be of the clinical and party insurance, so that if there is any insurance third party that occurs to be, if the patient claims that it is related for compensation because of his participation in the clinical trial, professional liability can be safe, and the product liability insurance will be safe, and the payment will be done from the clinical trial liability insurance. Therefore, because it very therefore amount, the amount has certain defined expectations, the insurance amount. How to be very careful about this amount getting into the enough way to the regulatory requirements of the countries. Here we are having the formula of certain compensation. This compensation must be very carefully about very carefully calculated on the age, occupations, incomes, age of the incomes, and basic risk of the with this complements we can understand that by age may require 20 lakhs compensation. So depending on the protocols, what we are the age criteria, the sense that contributed with insurance, the amount issued is sufficient to keep enough of the incidents that may not occur at hospitals, which is to indemnifications. So indemnification you know, be careful about insurance clauses. Who will be indemnified? What insurance and what kind of expected from the insurance policies. So for this companies and the jurisdiction also which is about the concepts of fraud or the insurance fraud and insurance restrictions. The is covered by the Indian restrictions and if certain conflicts occurs, then payments may not occur, the payments will not be by hospital. In such cases, we have to be careful if in cases that agreements between the agreement between concerns and the agreement between clinical health entities, the investigator and the institute will both should be of the kind that insurance companies will not be able to pay to the payments, pay to the payments will be the sponsors that may be recovered from the insurance company and where the party has been of clinical trials support the recommendations will be under the insurance into the process for the claims. This is for the will be fair and agreeable to the parties that insurance or the parties in Delhi they have not like the agreement the right that vice versa. This jurisdiction party not have jurisdiction between the hospital when it's the case or hospital when the entire amount the travel and the expenditure on the head of this also know about the them that they are indemnifying so exactly this will be indemnifying will the data something the information about this will never like to how it is jurisdiction. So we must where we are indemnifying, we are indemnifying other parties, and where we are indemnified by the other parties. This process should also be clear about the investigating on the clinical trials agreements. Jurisdiction in India or the parties in Indians agreement must be printed on the stamp paper, and the execution. The stamp duty is before and before the execution. What the parties once the banking of the stamp will be having the then it will be 1000 rupees. That is the double value. For example, 9 so this is very important and very important point. The all parties will be Indian agreements that Indian parties then they cannot have the international jurisdiction. It must be by default by the Indian jurisdictions. The conflict resolution must be understandable. What happens if there is conflict? So if there is a conflict or if there is a problem, sponsor is not then or if there is any difference in the sponsor and us, vice versa, there can be several things into it. That can be so from it the one way can settlements with a jurisdiction the wordings is considered as agreed by the parties. The second will be the arbitration where settlements are out of the legal expertise. And then is the miscellaneous clauses, which will be very small, very the giving special attention with the payment terms. Must be careful before the agreement is executed. And the letter with the with address with read and the agreement is executed, they will conduct of the study is it is usually into the this must be about the critical agreements trials target at the time must be agreed and agreements should be to the all parties must be clear what they have. In addition to that, they have certain small projects like process like the publication, the clauses about the responsibilities of the third party vendor is also another analysis that also will be the part of the agreement. Some clinical agreements draft is usually made by the people who are into these industries for the several years, but it must be reviewed very carefully and before the entry agreement is being executed. So for this, so about the executions, about the industrial executive hospitals, for the clinical study research, which we are studying the data we're talking about.